Good morning, everyone. Just want to thank you for attending our fifth and final season, our lecture of this season. We hope you all have enjoyed all of the lectures so far. They've been wonderful, and today's will be equally as exciting and entertaining and informative. We just would like to invite you all after the lecture to join us for our annual meeting that we have every spring, where the members of the Art League vote on our slate of officers and then share a lot of other information about the upcoming season. Normally we have this at the KIA, excuse me, with scones and tea and other wonderful treats, but we're doing it this way this year. So please stay on after the lecture and join us for our annual meeting. Now I'd like to turn it over to Barbara Brose, who will introduce Suzanne, our speaker today.
Thanks, Karen. You may have been in the audience in 2015 when we first introduced Suzanne Smeaton to Kalamazoo. If so, you will remember a lively talk that made you want to learn more about the art of the edge. And that's one of the reasons she's with us today. Suzanne pioneered scholarship in American period frames and has curated many exhibitions dedicated to them and consulted for numerous private and public collections. She's also framed artworks for many institutions, including the White House, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Yale University Art Gallery, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. After many years at the noted frame gallery Eli Wilner and Company in New York, she became an independent frame historian and consultant. She is a certified member of the Appraisers Association of America, an instructor for their appraisal studies program, and has become a member of its board of directors. Get ready for a fun lecture today with Suzanne Smeaton. What they'd say, frames could talk. Okay, Suzanne. Suzanne!
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's such a treat to be back speaking for Kalamazoo. I really enjoyed my time there a number of years ago, and am delighted to be able to speak with you today. We'll be talking about the often unsung artistry of the picture frames. If you think about it, picture frames complement, transform, and enhance artworks. They protect them, they adorn them, and they seek to best reveal them. I do want to mention that many of the images I'm using today are from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that's because I have the good fortune of living not far from the museum, the Encyclopedic Museum. And I have an opportunity to go there frequently. And I've had the privilege to work on framing of a lot of the artworks there. And I've become a master of surreptitious photography in order to get images of artworks with their frames on them. Of course, now in the modern digital world, people are a little more forgiving about artworks, but in any case, it's really a fascinating study, and I'm delighted that we're going to talk today about a lot of the artistry that's actually hiding in plain sight. And my PowerPoint is not responding. Oh, here we go. I'll do this. So we all look at art and seek to enjoy the image before us. This is Monet's painting of the garden at St. Andrés. It's a favorite painting of mine in the museum. You can feel the sunlight and the breeze on your skin. And so as we look at art, many of us don't realize the extent to which the frame around the picture informs our experience of viewing. And unless you're someone like me, more often than not, the impact of the frame on your experience of an artwork is mostly an unconscious process. But I think we would all agree that it certainly does make a difference. This is a painting by the Italian artist uh, Giovanni Favretto from 1876. And I would just remind you that, of course, these large, elaborate gilded frames were very much a part of their time during this period. But it also had an impact on exhibitions and viewing. And I love this. This is also by Favretto. I love this cartoon, almost, if you will, about the way that the size and scale of picture frames got a little crazy as time went by, because when you were at an exhibition, the artist wanted to make sure that his art was seen. And so the bigger the frame, the more frequently someone would be inclined to view the picture. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the different styles of frames that are apparent. Now, this is world-renowned Whistler's mother in what's known today as a Whistler frame. And the reason it's called a Whistler frame is because the molding design, the frame design, is something that is called reeded molding. And if you see the detail at the top left, you'll see there are these fine parallel lines that look much like reeds. And Whistler really favored this simpler form of frame design because it allowed his quiet tonalist paintings to really come to the fore. He felt that the more typically elaborate frames of the day really were competing with the images. And indeed, most of his tonalist paintings were referred to as arrangements. In other words, we know this painting as Whistler's Mother, but the actual title is Arrangement in Gray and Black #1. And so Whistler was very careful to make sure that the imagery was not overwhelmed by the frames. Whistler, interestingly, designed a number of frames as well. This is one example. This is actually a self-portrait of the artist called Arrangement in Gray. And you can see here that Whistler actually painted these little crosshatched designs on the surface here. So he's used the reeded molding, which, by the way, is not something that Whistler pioneered. He was a great friend to many of the British pre-Raphaelite artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti in particular. And both the use of reeded molding and what we call gilded oak as a surface was something that the pre-Raphaelites favored, and Whistler adopted that. The term gilded oak refers to the process of gilding the surface of the frame, usually oak in this case, without a layer of gesso, that thin preparatory layer. So you do get the beautiful lustrous quality of gold, but you also still see the grain of the wood. And Whistler was a big fan of this. I would mention that because of these tonalist paintings, these arrangements, if you will, Whistler went so far as to specify the different carats of leaf that he wanted on the different frames so that they would harmonize most directly with the artworks. The other thing I'll point out is this butterfly, not only in the detail right here, but also on the picture frame. You know, the butterfly cipher was the signature of sorts that Whistler used, but a lot of us aren't aware of the origin of that cipher. And I'm going to tell it to you in just a minute. I just wanted to show you, this is another painting. This is in the collection of the Frick. This is called The Ocean, or Symphony in Gray and Green, and has these beautiful little overlapping patterns. And there's that butterfly cipher again on the frame surface. So he's saying this frame too is a work of art, not just a painting that it surrounds. But the origin of the butterfly is very interesting. I learned this years ago from Barbara Weinberg, who is a curator at the Metropolitan Museum for many years. So James McNeill Whistler, and then you would draw the J, then you add the M, and then you add the W, and you get basically a butterfly. And that evolved, of course, into the more typically rendered butterfly, but that was the origin of this particular design by or motif that Whistler used. But there are a lot of surprising stories that happen in museums that we as museum goers almost never get to hear about. Back in about 1990 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they did a terrific exhibition of Italian Renaissance frames that are from the Lehman collection. And a lot of people don't realize that in addition to the furniture and the decorative objects and the incredible paintings that Robert Lehman collected, he also collected an extraordinary numbers of superlative frames, and a great many of them are these spectacular Italian Renaissance frames. So they put on an exhibition and they created this wonderful catalog. And along the way, they knew that they wanted to include this beautiful frame that's extraordinarily carved and has a beautiful little painting in the lunette. The painting in the lunette is by the painter Bartolomeo di Giovanni, and he was active from about 1488 to 1501. They also know that the frame is from the workshop of that's a mouthful, Giuliano de Maiano. He was the brother of the more famous Benedetto de Maiano, but you can see the beautiful, extraordinary carving. And they were active from about 1480 to 1500. So it's kind of incredible that this frame has survived these many hundreds of years and looks so terrific. But what was interesting is that even though they had this beautiful frame and it had this gorgeous lunette painting inside of it, there was nothing inside the main portion of the frame. And in the research for the exhibition, they realized that they have this beautiful painting by Botticelli that was the perfect size to fit in this lunette or below the lunette in the primary section of the picture frame. To further add interest, this painting by Botticelli is called The Last Communion of St. Jerome, and it was likely painted in the 1490s. And it was painted for a Florentine wool merchant. And the merchant was also a follower of both the painter of the lunette and who was known to collaborate with Botticelli. So we have to wonder, was this Botticelli originally in this frame? It makes a very compelling case. These are the sorts of things, though, sometimes we'll never be able to find them out when a painting is, or frame are 400 and 500 years old. We can't always track all the details, but this is a very happy marriage of painting and frame and a beautiful, beautiful result in the galleries. It has pride of place when you go in the galleries. Several hundred years forward, this is a painting by the American artist Thomas Eakins. This is a portrait of Senora Gomez Darza. And you might ask, well, what is this painting doing in a Spanish frame? This is a really beautiful, extraordinary Spanish frame. But what we discovered that's very interesting is that it turns out for these bust-length portraits that Eakins liked to use antique picture frames on a number of these bust-length portraits. So it makes sense in this case that this American artist with this painting of a Spanish woman, Senora Gomez Darza, is happily situated in this really special Spanish, 17th century Spanish frame. And speaking of frames chosen by artists, there are frames chosen by artists, frames designed by artists. This is one of my all-time favorite publications. It was it accompanied an exhibition in Europe of frames by European artists in the early, in the turn of the century, if you will. And it has many, many different chapters on a variety of different European artists, and all of them are beautifully illustrated including the picture frames, which is in itself a rarity. And among those that are covered is the Belgian symbolist painter Fernand Knopf. And this is a beautiful painting of his sister Marguerite. Now, one of the interesting things, this is a really unique frame. You can see that each of the sides are different. The top is very plain and narrow. The sides have a beautiful classical motif, and then it has a larger pediment to it. And it also is finished in a beautiful silver leaf that was really rather unusual for this time period. And here we see Marguerite in the Villa Knopf. This was a period photo that's in the book, and you can see it on view in its original frame. But what you don't know is that when I first started working at Eli Wilner and Company in the 1980s, we had this beautiful original frame in our inventory. It still had the nameplate on it, nameplate that said it was The Frame for Marguerite by Fernand Knopf. And it had a questionable history. We weren't clear how the people we had acquired it from had acquired it. And of course, this is not so unusual. You know, people often will change frames all the time. So someone must have had a different aesthetic they wanted to use for Marguerite. But happily, the owner of the painting ended up learning that there was this original frame for Marguerite and that we had that frame, and we were able to put them back together again. So now Marguerite is happily residing in the frame that Fernand Knopf designed for her. Interestingly, this is a frame design that Knopf used on other paintings. This is a beautiful little painting in the collection of the Getty Art Museum. And this is a picture of Jean Keffer. And she was a friend, or she was a daughter of the artist's friend, Gerald Kepfer. And you can see that it has, whoops, I'm sorry. Go back. It has that same beautiful neoclassical ornament down the sides and the silver motif. You can see a detail of it here on the right. Edgar Degas actually designed a great many frames for his painting. This is another version of that reeded molding we saw when we looked at the Whistler. And Degas actually experimented with different kinds of painted finishes. He would even paint some of his frames a sort of olive green color, very matte color. So radical for the time, but many people don't realize this was a time of great experimentation and innovation by the Impressionist artists. And unfortunately, a lot of the dealers and collectors weren't crazy about these unusual ideas. And so not a lot of these frames have survived. Happily, this one has. This is just to show you a page from the sketchbooks, several pages from Degas' sketchbooks. And you can see here where he's experimented with many different frame profiles and concepts and ideas for the frames. And he designed a great many of them and different variations on the theme. This is another version of what you might broadly call a reeded molding. Degas called it the coxcomb pattern. And if you're at the museum, this is in the Met's collection, you might look at this frame and really not think much about it. But it's actually a really very complex and sophisticated combination of cuts of back and forth. If you look at the detail, you can see there are different varying sizes, the extent to which they cut back in and come back out. It's a rather complex profile. And this was purchased by the Havemeyers, who were, he was an heir to the Domino sugar fortune. And they were extraordinary collectors. They bought a great many artworks And Mary Cassatt was a good friend of Havemeyer's, and when they would go to Paris, she would help to advise them on things to acquire. And they were very committed to doing the right thing by frames. And Degas, was very concerned about his frames and very interested in their designs. And in fact, there's even a story, I'm not sure if it's apocryphal or not, that if Degas went somewhere and saw that someone had acquired an artwork of his and removed his frame and put something he didn't approve of on it, he would repossess the painting. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's a great story. And here's another design of Degas. This is a frame that's referred to as the pipe frame. And the reason is, if you see the profile drawing in the bottom right, you can see that this profile looks like a pipe. These are still reeded elements on the very top rail at the outside edge, and then a wide flat panel. And of course, extraordinarily, this frame is painted white. This, as I said, is another example of the kind of frame that was really quite an innovation, but was not as appreciated by collectors and gallerists at the time. So many of them don't survive. But this is a fun picture. I always love pictures with pictures, framed pictures inside of them. And this is a painting by Renoir. Yvonne and Christine Lerolle at the piano. The Lerolles were good friends of Renoir and Degas. And you can see a detail of one of these white Degas frames there on the right. Well, back across the pond, we're looking at another painting by Thomas Eakins. This is one regarded as one of Eakins's masterpieces. This is called Swimming. And it was originally in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth, Texas. And it had been on loan for a number of years to the Amon Carter Museum, which is, if you've ever been to Fort Worth, it's just across the green from the Museum of Modern Art and the Kimball Art Museum. And so the Amon Carter made a deal, if you will, with the Museum of Modern Art to acquire Swimming from the museum, to basically possess it. It actually made a lot more sense being part of the Amon Carter Museum collection. And the curator knew that the frame was was probably something modern and not particularly appropriate to the picture. And she started looking at pictures of the memorial exhibition that had taken place. It was in Thomas Eakins Memorial Exhibition soon after he died. This took place in 1917 and early 18. And she started scrutinizing these period photographs. And I might interject that period photographs are such a boon to someone like myself who's studying the history of presentation and frame choices. So these are a gold mine. So sure enough, as she looked at this period photograph, she found the painting Swimming on view. If you look at the larger picture, it's just to the left of actually what is Gross's Clinic, another famous Eakins painting. And so she went back to the curators at the Museum of Modern Art and she said, "Are you sure you might not have the original frame for that Eakins kicking around in storage somewhere, maybe tucked away and forgotten?" And so they looked, and indeed, they were able to find the original frame in their storage unit. So the frame needed some restoration. And we at Eli Wilner and Company were asked to do the restoration work. And it was such a wonderful opportunity. And while the painting was there, the curator, Barbara Weinberg, who taught me about Whistler's cipher, was telling us about another painting in the collection of the Met called Arcadia. And she said, I think it would be great if we could copy the frame that we know is original to Eakins's Swimming painting and put it on Arcadia. So she approached the Amon Carter and she was given permission to have us replicate that frame for Arcadia. And we did. And Arcadia is a pretty good sized painting. But fast forward a number of years, and she said, the more I look at it, I feel like this painting of Arcadia is almost more of a study. It's not fully realized. And I feel that maybe that frame that's on swimming is too high style, if you will. And maybe something simpler might be better for Arcadia. So we ended up working with Barbara to choose this particular frame. It's that gilded oak surface I told you about, and this quiet, simple panel. And I think you'll agree that this is really a better choice than the elaborate frame from swimming for this particular painting. But I couldn't stop thinking about that spectacular replica we had made. And I thought it's just such a shame that this fabulous frame is languishing without a painting inside. So I went back to those period photographs of the Aikens exhibition, because I was aware of this other Aikens in the collection of the Met called The Writing Master. And this is actually a portrait of Aikens's father. And it was in a really dreadful picture frame. It was an older frame, a European frame that had been very poorly altered in size. The finish wasn't good. It really needed something better. And so I went back to those exhibition photos, and lo and behold, further to the right on that same wall as swimming is the Writing Master in that very same frame design. And happily, the size was very close to the replica we made. And so we were able to also reframe the Writing Master in a frame that's a copy of the original. Who knows where the original went? But it was a really happy ending to a story of having made such a frame. Well, this is one of my favorite frames in terms of really unusual. This is also in the Met. This painting is in the European Paintings Gallery. It's by an artist named de Camp. And when I saw it for the first time, it just stopped me in my tracks. It's such an unusual picture frame. And I thought to myself, that looks a lot like Tiffany. Some of the whorls and the use of what looks to me like the lead soldering material that you would use in stained glass. And I discovered that in addition to this frame and painting, there was a second one. So there are actually two of them in the collection of the Met. And I did ask the curator, Nani Friedlingheisen, who is the decorative arts curator, and she put on an incredible retrospective of Tiffany's works. And we cannot definitively produce documentation that proves it's Tiffany, but she feels very strongly that it is by Tiffany, in large part because the Havemeyers, who I mentioned earlier, who collected Degas, the Havemeyers, when they built a spectacular home on Fifth Avenue in New York, hired the Tiffany studios to do the interior design. So it's fair to assume that Tiffany decided to actually make a couple of very unusual picture frames for these two paintings. Now, just recently, I learned something really interesting about this is a Corot for the second one. The frame conservator at the Met is a good friend of mine, and we were talking about it, and she explained to me that if you go to the Met right now, you'll see this Corot on view, but she's in a different picture frame because this one is in the lab for some restoration. However, what you can't tell from this picture is that the back of the frame at the bottom in the rabbet, which is the channel where the art sits, the bottom rabbet has been made much, much larger to accommodate the canvas, which is longer, but it shows her actual pubic area. And it was determined that was really rather inappropriate and not nice to show. Of course, fast forward now, it's not an issue, but the frame had actually been adapted so that they could cover that scandalous bottom section of her torso, which I think is such a hoot. And here you just see a detail. And I'm sure if you've looked at some of the Tiffany decorative objects, whether the lamps or desk sets or things like that, a lot of these beautiful whirls and swirls and things like that are really recognizable motifs. Well, this little section I like to call the things aren't always what they appear section. And I just think this is a hoot. I went to an exhibition and they had the cardboard cutout of the queen. So, at first glance, no, I'm not visiting with the queen with my arm familiarly around her. This is a large, beautiful landscape by William Lamb Picknell, American artist who was working in France. And it's in this gorgeous picture frame, and it's a little hard to tell in the image, but the frame is deeper. In other words, the outermost edge is the highest point on the frame. So this way these beautiful successive sections are affected, they lead the eye into the painting. So you really feel the perspective that Picknell's created. You feel like you can enter this picture frame. But for a long time, if you went to the Met, when you saw the Picknell, here's just a detail of that. And you can see this is very typical of 19th century frames where they might, if you could see them from behind, you might see that there are 3 or 4 or more sections that are made and then sort of fit together, interlocking. But for a long time, the Picknell was on view like this. It was a fraction of that picture frame. In fact, it was, you see where these beads are about halfway across the molding, from the beads all the way into the picture frame. That's all that was surrounding this Picknell. So this is referred to as the liner, this innermost section. And so the curators said, well, I guess we're going to have to get another frame. This is really just a fragment. And we said, well, there's no point in throwing away this beautiful original liner. So what we did was we provided them with a variety of outer elements to choose from, frames from the same period that would have been appropriate for this picture and not been atypical. And they selected this particular one, and then we replicated it and essentially wrapped it around the original liner. So when you go to the museum, you're actually looking at a frame that's half original and half a replication. Here's a similar story. This is very popular painting at the Met. This is Bastien Lepage's depiction of Joan of Arc. It's a really large painting. And if you'll look at it, it seems like a somewhat narrow frame for the painting. But if you look at this frame up close and you look at the sides, you'll see that it's raw wood. And the reason for that is the same as the Picknell. What you're looking at is just the liner on the Lepage. But it seems to be fine for the museum. Nobody's too worried about it. So they're not going to be spending time and finding a large outer element like they did for the Picknell. But it is very interesting that this painting can be on view in just its simple liner, and that the edges of the frame aren't even, or of this liner haven't even been, painted or gilded to finish it in any way. Well, this is a painting by Rembrandt. It's a portrait of Herman Dumer, who was an ebonist in the Netherlands. And it is a beautiful black frame. And for many years, I was under the impression that the conjecture, if you will, that was that Dumer had actually made this picture frame as an ebonist. It would not have been unusual for him to have made the frame for his own portrait. And we know that his son Lambert, Dumer's son Lambert, studied with Rembrandt. But fast forward a number of years, and it turns out that a frame expert named Timothy Newberry from England, who is his knowledge of European frames and frame history is encyclopedic. He told me, and I'm going to quote from him, says these molding segments may have been reused from a piece of 17th century Bavarian furniture. The surface is painted black to resemble the costly ebony and serves as an homage to the esteemed ebony worker depicted in the portrait. The frame was put on the painting in the 1990s. Frames of this type were made in Vienna and Prague in the 17th century. So I think that's such a fascinating repurposing of a cabinet from the same period to create a frame that of the same date, but actually a frame made from a cabinet. And it looks terrific. One of the things I love about this is that they have left a lot of the obvious signs of age where the wood has been eaten by bugs and some of it's come away. To me, this just really lends authenticity and a sense of depth to the history of the painting and frame. This is another surprising story that most people will never hear. This is a portrait of Eleanor Hardy Bunker. She was the wife of the painter Dennis Miller Bunker. And this is in the American wing at the Met. And it is in a spectacular Stanford White frame. Stanford White was a great fan of the Italian Renaissance. And so this frame is really interesting in that it is a tabernacle frame. So the interior portion is very typical of the Italian Renaissance tabernacle frame, but then it's wrapped around. It's almost like another frame, a series of ornament are wrapped around that tabernacle, and you can see. And this is quintessential Stanford White and really high Stanford White. But one of the other things that most people don't even think twice about is if you read the label, it says that this painting is a gift of several gentlemen. Well, Dennis Miller Bunker was actually a great friend of Stanford White, of George Platt, of many people that were involved in the Society of American Artists at the time. And when Bunker died, it's really a sad story. He died just a few months after he and Eleanor were married. And so they said, we must give a painting by Bunker to the Metropolitan Museum in his memory. And so they were able to acquire this portrait. Well, Stanford White, frame designer that he was, in addition to, of course, being a spectacular architect and expert on interior decorative schemes, he was making this particular frame for an entirely different painting for Abbot Thayer, who he made a great many frames for, or designed a great number of frames for them. And the interesting piece of that story is that the gilding scheme, much like Whistler's attention to the color tones of gilding, White was very aware of those. And the frame had a gilding scheme that had a more greenish cast to it. But he convinced Thayer to let them use this frame for the Bunker portrait, and then he would make something else for Thayer. And so then he even went so far as to have the gilding changed so that it had a more yellowish cast that was more sympathetic. And they made both the frame and the painting a gift to the museum in Bunker's memory. But it's lovely that it's just noted as a gift of several gentlemen. It was an effort from the Society of American Artists. So wonderful story that you might never know the details of. Well, we can't talk about frames and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and not talk about Madame X. She's, painting that everyone has heard of. Her actual name is Virginie Amélie Avegno. She was Madame Pierre Gautreau. Interestingly, she was from New Orleans and had gone to Paris. She was of French ancestry, and she married an older man, a significantly older man named Pierre Gautreau. And she, here she looks just pale, but if you actually see the painting, she almost has a lavender cast. And apparently this was something that certain Parisian women did during this period, is they powdered themselves with this powder that would give them this kind of lavender cast. It turned out later that it had some really uh, deleterious components to it, but it really gave a special effect. Well, many of you have probably heard the story that when Sargent painted this portrait and put it on view, it was originally painted with the strap falling off her shoulder on the right side. And when this painting was on view at the Salon of 1884, it basically became really nothing short of a scandal. Because interestingly, this is the narrow frame that this Madame X was on view in the museum. There was such a brouhaha. Here's a picture of Sargent in his studio in 1884, and you can see the large, spectacular French frame that he's chosen to put on it. But this painting created such a scandal only because she was very much in Paris society, and everyone felt there were two somewhat scandalous parts of this depiction. One was this idea that the rhinestone strap was falling off her shoulder, and the thought was that that was some sort of commentary on, was she a loose woman? And also the dress, the style of gown she's wearing, did not require any kind of intense undergarments like most of the gowns at the time, and that was considered scandalous. Now it's sad because Ginny Gautreau and her mother loved the portrait until it went up in the Salon and created such a furor in town. And so they chose not to purchase it from Sargent. And it was actually a major turning point in Sargent's career. He decided to leave Paris and he went to England and worked and painted in England, and did some spectacular later work there because of this really unsettling. He really felt that this painting of Madame X was, was a masterpiece, and indeed it was. But it hadn't sold. And so it wasn't until 1916 that Sargent actually sold this painting to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he asked that they not put her name on it, and that they noted it as Madame X out of respect for her. She was still alive. By the way, if you ever want to read more about this, there's a fabulous book called Strapless by Deborah Davis. And it's all about Ginny Gautreau, about Sargent's painting of her, what happened. It's a really, really super story. I highly recommend the book. So back at the museum, the curators were saying, well, that narrow frame that's on it, is certainly not worthy of an icon like this. And so we took that period photograph of Sargent in his studio and used that as sort of inspiration. And the curator found this frame in storage, or actually it was on a painting of Benjamin West, who is a very early 19th century painter. And it had a label on the back. Both the style of the frame and the label tell us it's a late 19th century picture frame. And it had a label on it by Thomas Wilmertz and Sons, and they were well-known New York City frame makers. And so because this frame was almost 100 years away from the date of the Benjamin West painting, she determined that she would take that frame off the Benjamin West. We altered it to fit Madame X, and she was appropriately reframed in this lovely rendition of the French. So you can see what an improvement it is from the narrow frame, modest, uninteresting frame that was on her before. Well, I'd like to conclude with an interesting story of two paintings in the collection of the St. Louis Museum of Art. They had me come to St. Louis a couple of years ago, and as I often do, we walk through the galleries and then we go into storage and we look at what's in storage. And we identified more than a few frames that were empty, but had labels on the back of what they were on. Well, these two paintings, the Philip Guston and the Marston Hartley, were both on view. They're very similar periods. They were on view in the galleries in these frames. But when we were going through storage, we found these two different frames. The frame on the left was marked that it had come off the Guston, and the frame on the right, the frame had come off the Hartley. And even more noteworthy is that this inscription you see in the bottom right was on the frame for the Guston, frame made for Philip Guston by Carl Sandelin, frame maker. Well, Carl Sandelin is someone who often signed his frames like this. It's just really just a pencil inscription on the back, but he designed and made a great many frames for Edward Hopper and for other noted artists. So the fact that this was a Sandelin frame with its original inscription on the back was really something. And similarly, the frame for the Hartley. One of the things that's noteworthy about both of these frames is this textural effect that they both have. And this was a very popular device during this period in the 30s and the 40s, this notion of texture and the way that textural surface really spoke to the canvases. Hartley in particular really loved this really, what I would define as a coarse surface that was a very intentional manipulated surface. So the curators decided, where at first blush, this looks good enough on the Philip Guston, they decided it would look a lot better in the original frame. And one of the things I like about this particular marriage is the tonality of the frame and how the tonality is more congruent with the rest of the composition. And also introduces that texture, actually even speaks to this depiction of these young boys playing in the street. And similarly, this Hartley, if you didn't know to think twice about it, and you're in the galleries, that silver frame looks nice enough on it. But if you put it in the original frame, this notion of texture really speaks to the beach, the driftwood, and of course, Hartley's vigorous brushwork. You know, there was a noted frame maker, Boston frame maker, Herman Dudley Murphy. And Murphy said that choosing the right frame for a painting was like finding the perfect dress for a beautiful woman, a setting that would allow her to shine. I hope that these stories have inspired you today to notice the artistry inherent in the picture frame choices that reveal with bravura and that do their work quietly with sensitivity and subtle skill. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to go down here and locate the chat. Let's see, I believe it's supposed to pop up. Whoops. Let me go back to view screen. Sorry about that. Slideshow. Oh goodness, I'm going to have to scroll all the way through. I'm having trouble finding the chat. Oh, I think it might be up here. Oh, I apologize.
Suzanne, it should be at the very bottom. It's right next to the share screen icon that you chose earlier.
Well, the shares, okay, let me
Just
click.
wiggle it around. It looks like a little.
Okay, yeah, it's not coming up. I'm wondering if it's because my PowerPoint is like in full mode or something.
Well, here, I could just ask you the questions then if that's easier.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'd be happy to do it, but it's not animating the chat box.
All right, here's one question. At what time did the ornate gilded frame become passé? Did early 20th century artists pay similar attention to details with their frames?
Oh, yes, very much so. I'm just going to scroll through to my last slide because it has my email address and my website on it in case anybody would like to reach out later with a question or a comment. There's always been, reform and interest and that sort of thing in frames and frame design. And absolutely, it was the turn of the 19th to the 20th century when the more elaborate frames had less favor. And and if you think about it, it makes sense because first it was Impressionism, and that was different colors, different styles of brushwork, different media. And that's when carved and gilded frames became more popular, and the hand of the artist became very important, and the frames were a lot simpler, which made sense. It was a different style of artwork. So in the early years of the 20th century, following the Impressionist innovations, there were similar innovations that reflected the modern and modernism. And that's when you see a lot more use of silver surfaces, which makes sense. It's the color of machinery and airplanes, the very modern things during this period, and simpler frames, and some artist designed frames. And then as you go forward, I really of the opinion that it was when the abstract expressionists really became popular, and this notion of no surround, no barriers, no nothing, and there were these large canvases, many of them, that frames almost disappear entirely. And if they had a frame, it was just a narrow wood strip frame. I think that was partly driven by the aesthetic, and I think it was also partly driven by economy, that it would have been really costly to frame all of these really large paintings by these innovators.
It's great. We have 3 more questions. Here's one. Assuming the frames were hand carved at the time, how was the detail so precise, or was a different method used to create the intricate patterns?
Well, most of the elaborate 19th century frames that we look at are actually made. They're a wooden substrate, but all the decorative ornament is made from a material called composition, or compo. And compo is chalk, hide glue, linseed oil, and resin, and it's a moldable putty. It's not poured, it's not a cast material. So it's a moldable putty that was pressed into these really intricately reverse carved molds. And when it came out of the mold, it was still soft and pliable. It would allow them to drape it over a curve, to even eke out a little extra 1/8 of an inch or condense it so that the ornaments resolve beautifully. And then when it dries hard. It can be treated just like carved wood. So that was the way most 19th century frames were made. And then the later frames, like the one on the screen now, this is a beautiful carved frame by Herman Dudley Murphy, who I quoted at the end. And I think I'm answering your question. So it was actually just the refinement of detail, and putting a thin enough layer of this gesso material that prepared the surface for gilding to retain all that ornament. But actually, both the compo and the carved ornaments could have similar degrees of crispness of detail.
That's great. Actually, you answered one of the other questions as well with that information about the frame on this last slide. So our last question is, in general, who are the makers of frames? Was there ever a guild?
They're not in the US. There were absolutely guilds throughout Europe. And the notion is that it was actually World War I that contributed to the decimation of the guild system. It was such a disruptor. And it's interesting, 17th and 18th century France was really the zenith of carving and gilding. And there were entire guilds to different facets of the gilding process. And so in the when I talk about the history of American frame designs, I usually start with the very beginning of the 19th century. And that's because prior to that time, most of the frames that were made were either made by European craftsmen or based on European pattern books. And it isn't until that time that a uniquely American aesthetic starts to develop. And so there never really is a guild system per se, but even to this day, if you want to learn these special frame making skills and carving skills, you really need to go to a workshop, to someone who's actually doing the work and, you know, train at their elbow.
Okay, I think that's it for our questions. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was fascinating. I hate to admit that I don't really pay that much attention to the frames, but now when I hit the museums, I just know that there's a story behind it. Can you spell the word for the mold that they used, or the material that they use? Is it CAMO or KAMO?
Oh, it's the word composition, COMPOS. I'm just spelling it in my head. Composition, SITION, composition, and it's often referred to as compo.
Okay, very good.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very, very much for your lecture and for joining us back in Kalamazoo. That concludes your lecture.
Thank you.
And I invite everybody to hang on, and we'll start our general meeting. But thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Whew. Okay. Well, there we go. Whoops. Can we start at the, don't look, everybody. Don't look at the screen.